The second the water stopped flowing, I knew somebody had just made the most expensive mistake of their life. The faucet coughed once, sputtered twice, and then fell completely silent. I stood in my kitchen holding a coffee mug, listening to a sound I had not heard in nearly 20 years. Nothing. No rush of water through the pipes. No familiar hum from the pressure system. Just silence. Outside, the summer heat was already beginning to build across the valley. The forecast called for 96 degrees before noon, and every acre of my property depended on a functioning water system. My name is Nathan Walker, and I have spent most of my life around wells, pumps, pipelines, reservoirs, and irrigation systems. My grandfather drilled the original well on our land decades ago. My father expanded the distribution network. I became a water systems engineer before eventually returning home to manage the family property. Water was not simply a utility to me. It was infrastructure. It was history. It was the reason entire sections of our community existed in the first place. That morning, something felt wrong immediately. Wells do not simply stop working without warning. Equipment fails, but failures leave clues. Pressure drops gradually. Pumps cycle irregularly. Gauges tell stories. This felt different. Too sudden. Too clean. I walked outside and headed toward the pump house located near the edge of my property. Dry grass crunched beneath my boots. The air smelled faintly of dust and warm earth. In the distance, sprinklers throughout neighboring properties continued operating normally, sending arcs of water across carefully maintained lawns. My system, however, was completely dead. When I opened the pump house door, the answer appeared within seconds. The disconnect switch had been shut off. Not damaged. Not broken. Shut off. Deliberately. I stared at it for several moments. Then I slowly smiled. Not because I was happy, because I suddenly understood exactly what had happened. For months, Patricia Holloway, president of the local HOA, had been looking for ways to pressure me into complying with a series of demands involving landscaping, easements, and access agreements that had absolutely nothing to do with her authority. My property sat outside HOA jurisdiction, a fact she never seemed willing to accept. Every conversation eventually ended the same way. She insisted she could control something she did not actually control. I politely disagreed. Apparently, she had decided to escalate. Later that morning, while inspecting the perimeter fence near the access road, I spotted Patricia standing beside two HOA board members. Even from several hundred feet away, her expression told me everything. She looked pleased with herself. The kind of pleased that comes from believing a lesson has just been taught. What she did not know was that I had spent years studying every document connected to this valley's water system. Every easement, every transfer agreement, every engineering drawing, every reservoir connection. Some people collect family photographs. My family collected water maps. And hidden inside those maps was a detail so important that it would eventually turn this entire situation upside down. As the afternoon sun climbed higher and my property remained without water, Patricia probably thought she was winning. What she could not see was that I had already started pulling old records from storage. Because when someone interferes with infrastructure, the smartest response is never anger. The smartest response is understanding exactly how the system works. The rest of that afternoon disappeared inside a storage room that most people would have considered a museum. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls. Rolled engineering drawings sat inside aging tubes. Decades of permits, surveys, easement agreements, and water district records filled shelves built by my father long before computers became standard. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight coming through the small windows. The smell of old paper and machine oil hung in the air. I unlocked a cabinet labeled water rights and pulled open a drawer that weighed nearly as much as a toolbox. If Patricia wanted to turn this into a battle over infrastructure, then infrastructure was exactly where I intended to look. Most people see a reservoir and assume it is simple. Water goes in. Water comes out. Reality is far more complicated. Every reservoir depends on a network. Wells, pumps, recharge agreements, maintenance easements, overflow channels, emergency supply connections, monitoring stations, and distribution routes all work together. Remove one piece, and unexpected consequences begin appearing elsewhere. My grandfather understood that. My father understood that. They documented everything. As I sorted through folders, I found records dating back almost 40 years. Original engineering surveys, county planning maps, Utility agreements signed before the subdivision even existed. The HOA neighborhood, now sitting across the road, had once been cattle pasture. Long before houses appeared, our family land supplied part of the water infrastructure supporting the area. Most residents never knew that history because everything operated quietly in the background. Systems only become interesting when they stop working. Around 3 o'clock, I spread several large maps across a work table. Colored lines crossed the drawings like veins through a living organism. Blue indicated water transmission routes. Red marked easements. Green identified maintenance corridors. I traced one particular line with my finger and felt the first hint that something much bigger was hiding beneath the surface. The line originated near my property. It continued toward a pumping station. From there, it connected to infrastructure feeding the community reservoir used by the subdivision. I pulled a second map, then a third. The pattern remained identical. Interesting. Very interesting. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. The caller was Daniel Mercer, a retired county engineer I had known for years. We occasionally exchanged information about water projects and land records. After a brief conversation, I casually asked whether he remembered the old supplemental supply agreements tied to the subdivision reservoir. There was a pause. Then he laughed. Most people forgot those existed, he said. That answer immediately caught my attention. We spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Nothing he said directly solved the mystery, but several pieces began fitting together. Historical agreements, backup supply routes, maintenance responsibilities, easement access. By the time the call ended, I knew exactly which files I needed next. Outside, the heat of the day slowly began fading. Across the valley, sprinklers continued running on perfectly green HOA lawns. Patricia probably looked out her window feeling satisfied. She likely believed shutting down my well pump had established control. What she did not realize was that every hour gave me more information. And information is dangerous when it lands in the hands of someone who understands how systems work. As evening settled over the property, I finally located a thick folder buried near the back of a cabinet. The label had faded with age, but the words were still readable. Supplemental Reservoir Support Agreement. I opened the folder, turned to the first page, and immediately understood why my grandfather kept it. Suddenly, the entire situation started making sense. I spent most of the evening reading every page inside that faded folder. Some documents were so old they had been typed on machines that no longer existed. Others contained hand-drawn annotations from engineers who retired decades ago. Yet despite their age, the records painted an exceptionally clear picture. The subdivision reservoir did not operate as an isolated system. During periods of heavy demand, drought conditions, maintenance interruptions, or emergency supply events, supplemental water support could legally move through infrastructure connected to my family's property. The arrangement dated back to agreements established long before the HOA existed. Back when the valley was mostly farmland, cooperation mattered more than politics. Landowners, engineers, and county planners built systems designed to survive dry years. They understood that water security depended on interconnected resources. Modern homeowners enjoyed the benefits without realizing how much planning supported them. Around 9 o'clock that night, I laid 3 separate maps side by side across the table. The lines matched perfectly. Easements crossed my property. Utility corridors intersected old service routes. Most importantly, several active agreements still referenced access points tied directly to infrastructure under my legal control. I leaned back in my chair and slowly exhaled. Patricia had no idea what she had stepped into. The next morning began with another reminder that my well remained offline. The silence coming from the pipes still felt unnatural. Yet instead of frustration, I felt increasingly curious. I wanted answers. Specifically, I wanted to know who authorized the shutdown and under what authority they believed they were acting. Shortly after sunrise, I drove toward the subdivision entrance. Freshly watered lawns stretched across the neighborhood. Decorative fountains circulated water near the clubhouse. Sprinklers operated on schedule. Everything looked normal. On the surface, at least. As I passed the community office, I spotted Patricia speaking with several board members outside the building. Her posture radiated confidence. She looked like someone convinced a problem had been solved. When she noticed my truck slowing near the entrance, her expression shifted into a small smile. Not a friendly smile. The kind people wear when they believe they have won. I returned a polite wave and kept driving. There was no reason to argue. Arguments change very little. Documentation changes everything. Later that afternoon, I scheduled meetings with two different professionals. The first was a water rights attorney familiar with regional infrastructure agreements. The second was an engineering consultant who occasionally assisted counties with utility system reviews. I provided copies of the documents and maps I had assembled. Both reactions were remarkably similar. Neither person appeared surprised by the agreements themselves. What surprised them was the apparent decision to interfere with infrastructure connected to those agreements without first reviewing the underlying records. One of them actually laughed while studying a map. "Whoever approved this never looked beyond the first layer," he said. That statement lingered in my mind long after the meeting ended. Because that was exactly the problem. Patricia never investigated systems. She investigated appearances. If something looked simple, she assumed it was simple. Water infrastructure is never simple. By late afternoon, additional documents arrived through email. Easement records, maintenance obligations, historical county correspondence. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. Every new page reinforced the same conclusion. My property occupied a far more important position in the regional water network than most residents realized, including the HOA leadership. As sunset painted the valley in shades of gold and orange, I stood near the pump house reviewing the growing stack of paperwork. The solution was finally beginning to emerge. Not through retaliation, not through confrontation, through legal rights already written into the system decades ago. And once those rights were exercised, the consequences would arrive naturally. No arguments required. Over the next several days, I stopped thinking like a property owner and started thinking like an engineer. Every morning began the same way. Coffee, maps, records, notes. The stack of documents on my desk continued growing until it covered nearly every available surface in the office. Easement agreements sat beside maintenance reports. Historical surveys overlapped utility diagrams. Decades of planning decisions slowly revealed themselves piece by piece. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. Patricia believed she had targeted a single well pump. In reality, she had interfered with a component connected to a much larger system. The distinction mattered more than she could possibly understand. On Tuesday morning, I met with the water rights attorney again. This time we reviewed several newly discovered county filings that had not been referenced in years. One document in particular immediately caught his attention. It outlined emergency operational procedures associated with supplemental water infrastructure supporting the subdivision reservoir. He read the language twice before setting the document down on the table. "This changes everything," he said. I already suspected that. Hearing it from someone else only confirmed my conclusions. Later that afternoon, I drove to the county records office to verify several easement boundaries. The employee assisting me disappeared into the archive section and returned carrying a thick collection of engineering files. Some pages contained original signatures from planners who helped develop the valley decades earlier. Others showed detailed diagrams of pumps, pipelines, and transfer points. One map in particular immediately stood out. A bold line crossed directly through a section of my property before continuing toward infrastructure associated with the HOA reservoir. Beside it sat a notation referencing supplemental support access rights. I photographed the page and added it to my growing collection. Every new record reinforced the same truth. The system had never been designed to function independently. Cooperation was built into its foundation. By Wednesday, the situation around the neighborhood had become increasingly interesting. Residents noticed my irrigation system remained offline. Some assumed equipment had failed. Others speculated about maintenance work. Meanwhile, HOA landscaping crews continued watering common areas as though nothing had happened. Decorative ponds remained full. Community lawns remained green. Patricia likely viewed that as proof of success. From her perspective, she had applied pressure without consequence. What she did not realize was that consequences inside infrastructure systems often arrive later. First comes the decision. Then comes the paperwork. Then comes the process. Finally comes the outcome. The outcome was approaching quickly. That evening, I received several emails from engineering professionals reviewing the records I had shared. Their assessments were remarkably consistent. The agreements appeared valid. The easements appeared enforceable. The operational rights remained active. Most importantly, The response options available to me were entirely legal. No loopholes, no tricks, no retaliation, just procedures that had existed for years. As sunset painted the hills beyond the valley in deep orange light, I stood near the silent pump house once again. The stillness no longer bothered me. In fact, it had become useful. Every additional day without resolution generated more documentation, more evidence, more support for the actions I was preparing to take. Across the road, lights began appearing throughout the subdivision as residents returned home for the evening. Somewhere among those houses sat Patricia, undoubtedly convinced she remained in control of the situation. I looked down at the latest engineering map folded beneath my arm and smiled. Because for the first time since the shutdown occurred, I knew exactly what would happen next. And when the process finally started moving forward, the reservoir would become the center of everyone's attention. Thursday morning began with paperwork. Not exciting paperwork. Not dramatic paperwork. The kind that quietly changes outcomes months before anyone realizes it. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting in a conference room at the county water management office with a stack of documents nearly 4 inches thick. Engineering maps covered one end of the table. Easement agreements covered the other. Representatives from the county, legal advisors, and infrastructure specialists reviewed the records one page at a time. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. Professionals rarely need to. The facts were already doing the talking. What interested everyone most was not the well itself. It was the network connected to it. As the discussion progressed, several engineers began tracing routes across the maps. Colored markers identified transfer lines, support corridors, maintenance access paths, and emergency supply connections. Every route pointed toward the same conclusion. The subdivision reservoir depended on supplemental infrastructure tied to agreements crossing my property. During normal conditions, most residents never noticed the relationship. Water systems are designed to appear invisible when functioning correctly. Yet hidden beneath that simplicity sat decades of engineering decisions. Those decisions were documented with remarkable precision. Around midday, one county official summarized the situation in a single sentence. The support agreement remains active. The room fell quiet for a moment. Not because the statement surprised anyone. Because it confirmed everything. The agreement had never been terminated. It had never been replaced. It had never been transferred elsewhere. Legally speaking, the framework remained exactly where it had always been. That afternoon, formal notices began moving through the appropriate channels. I was not initiating retaliation. I was exercising rights associated with infrastructure that my family had maintained and supported for generations. There is an important difference between those two things. One is emotional. The other is procedural. Procedures have a way of producing outcomes that emotions cannot stop. Back at the property, I spent the remainder of the day reviewing correspondence while contractors inspected portions of the system affected by the unauthorized shutdown. Their findings only strengthened the growing record. Every inspection generated another report. Every report generated another document. Every document reinforced the same narrative. The more people examined the situation, the stronger my position became. Meanwhile, Patricia appeared increasingly confident. Several neighbors later told me she openly discussed the situation as though it had already been resolved. She apparently viewed the lack of immediate consequences as proof she had acted correctly. That assumption fascinated me. Infrastructure rarely responds immediately. Reservoirs do not empty the moment a decision is made. Systems possess momentum. They continue functioning until underlying conditions begin changing. Then the effects appear. And when they appear, they often arrive faster than expected. On Friday morning, I received confirmation that the supplemental support provisions would be temporarily suspended while ongoing reviews addressed the interference issues surrounding connected infrastructure. The decision followed established procedures outlined in the agreements themselves. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary, just the system functioning exactly as designed. I read the notice twice before placing it inside the growing file on my desk. Then I walked outside. The valley stretched beneath a cloudless blue sky. The subdivision reservoir glimmered in the distance, reflecting sunlight like polished glass. At first glance, it looked unchanged. Stable, secure, permanent. Yet I understood something most residents did not. Reservoirs are measurements of balance. Water enters. Water leaves. Remove one side of the equation and conditions begin shifting. Slowly at first, then very quickly. As evening settled across the landscape, I found myself standing near the property line looking toward the subdivision. Somewhere beyond those rooftops, Patricia was probably enjoying another quiet evening. She still believed she had sent a message. What she did not realize was that the system had finally begun responding. And once the numbers started changing, everyone in the neighborhood would notice. The first signs appeared on Monday. Not dramatic signs, not headlines, not emergency vehicles, just numbers. Infrastructure problems almost always begin as numbers. Reservoir levels that should remain stable start trending downward. Usage reports stop matching projections. Refill rates fail to keep pace with demand. Most residents never notice these details because they happen quietly behind the scenes. Engineers notice. Water managers notice. Operations personnel notice. And by Monday afternoon, they were definitely noticing. I was reviewing correspondence in my office when Daniel Mercer called. The retired county engineer sounded amused. "People are asking questions," he said. "I already knew they would be." The supplemental support provisions had been suspended for only a short period. Yet the reservoir was responding exactly as historical models predicted. Summer temperatures remained high. Irrigation demand remained strong. Community landscaping continued consuming water. Under normal conditions, the system compensated automatically. Without the supplemental support framework, however, the math changed. Water was still available. Nobody was facing an emergency, but the safety margin was shrinking faster than expected. By Tuesday morning, HOA maintenance crews were conducting additional monitoring around the reservoir. Residents began noticing trucks parked near utility access points. Conversations started appearing throughout the neighborhood. Most people assumed routine maintenance was taking place. Others suspected equipment issues. Very few understood the real cause. Across the valley, life on my property continued normally despite the disabled well. Contractors completed inspections. Attorneys reviewed filings. County officials processed documentation. Everything moved forward through established procedures. No shortcuts, no surprises, just paperwork doing what paperwork does best, creating a record. That afternoon, I drove past the reservoir on my way back from a meeting. The water surface looked perfectly normal to the average observer. Yet years of experience allowed me to see details others missed. The shoreline sat slightly lower than expected. Intake markers appeared more exposed. Small changes, but meaningful ones. Systems reveal their condition long before they reach critical points. The reservoir was revealing its condition. On Wednesday, the first emergency HOA board meeting was announced. Residents received notices citing concerns about water management planning and operational reviews. The language remained carefully controlled. Nobody wanted to create panic. The problem was that questions were spreading faster than answers. Why was the reservoir level dropping? Why were engineers conducting additional reviews? Why were county officials suddenly involved? Patricia reportedly assured everyone the situation was under control. Unfortunately for her, confidence and reservoir levels are measured differently. One depends on opinion. The other depends on mathematics. Late that evening, I received updated reports from professionals monitoring the situation. The findings matched expectations almost exactly. Demand exceeded projections. Supplemental contributions remained unavailable. Existing reserves were being consumed faster than anticipated. Again, nothing catastrophic. Just predictable consequences flowing through a system that had lost one of its supporting components. The irony was impossible to ignore. Patricia wanted to send a message. Instead, she had triggered a chain of events that forced everyone to examine infrastructure they previously ignored. By Thursday morning, residents began discussing the issue openly. Some questioned management decisions. Others wanted technical explanations. A few started researching old county records. That was when the situation became truly interesting. Because once people start reading documents, assumptions begin losing power. As sunset arrived that evening, I stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. The reservoir reflected the fading orange sky. From a distance, everything still appeared calm, peaceful even. Yet beneath that calm surface, pressure was building. Reports were circulating. Meetings were multiplying. Questions were spreading. And somewhere inside the HOA office, Patricia was slowly discovering that water systems have a habit of exposing mistakes far more effectively than arguments ever could. By the following week, the conversation had shifted completely. Nobody was talking about my well anymore. Nobody was talking about landscaping disputes, access disagreements, or HOA authority. Every discussion centered on one thing: water. The reservoir had become the most important topic in the community. Residents checked updates. Board members scheduled meetings. Engineers reviewed reports. Questions multiplied faster than answers. And with every passing day, the same uncomfortable reality became harder to ignore. The system was behaving exactly the way the historical records predicted it would. Early Monday morning, I received a call from Daniel. He sounded equal parts impressed and amused. "People finally found the old maps," he said. I laughed because I knew exactly what that meant. For weeks, only a handful of professionals had been reviewing the infrastructure documents. Now residents were discovering them as well. Copies of easement records, county filings, and historical agreements had begun circulating among homeowners. Once people started reading the paperwork themselves, the narrative changed quickly. The documents did not contain opinions. They contained dates, signatures, engineering notes, and legal obligations. Facts tend to travel surprisingly fast once they are written down. That afternoon, a special HOA meeting filled the clubhouse beyond capacity. Residents wanted explanations. Maintenance costs were increasing. Monitoring efforts were expanding. Outside consultants were becoming involved. Questions about infrastructure management suddenly carried real consequences. Several neighbors who attended later described the atmosphere as tense but controlled. Patricia attempted to reassure everyone that the situation remained manageable. The problem was that residents were no longer relying solely on reassurance. They had documents. They had reports. They had questions. Most importantly, they had begun connecting events together. Around the same time, county engineers completed another review of the system. Their conclusions reinforced everything already documented. Supplemental support routes remained unavailable due to the ongoing infrastructure dispute. Reservoir performance reflected the absence of those resources. Operational flexibility had decreased. Again, no emergency existed. Water continued flowing throughout the neighborhood. Yet the margin for error was shrinking. Every engineer understood the implications immediately. Many residents were beginning to understand them as well. On Tuesday evening, I drove past the reservoir again. The setting sun reflected across the water while maintenance personnel checked monitoring equipment along the shoreline. Several months earlier, I would have passed without a second glance. Now the reservoir had become the physical symbol of a much larger lesson. Infrastructure rarely receives attention when it works properly. People assume systems exist independently. They do not see the agreements, easements, partnerships, and engineering decisions holding everything together. They only notice once those connections become visible. Patricia had unintentionally made every hidden connection visible. Wednesday brought the first significant public challenge to her version of events. During another community meeting, several residents reportedly presented copies of county records showing the historical relationship between my property and reservoir support operations. The questions became increasingly specific. Who authorized the interference? Were legal reviews conducted beforehand? Did anyone examine the underlying agreements? According to multiple neighbors, Patricia struggled to provide clear answers. Confidence works best when nobody checks the paperwork. Unfortunately for her, everyone was checking the paperwork now. As darkness settled across the valley that evening, I sat on my porch reviewing the latest reports. Crickets chirped in the distance. Warm air drifted across the fields. Somewhere beyond the hills, irrigation systems continued operating under carefully managed schedules. Everything felt remarkably calm. Yet beneath that calm, momentum was building. Residents wanted transparency. Engineers wanted compliance. County officials wanted resolution. And buried inside a growing stack of maps, reports, and agreements sat one final piece of evidence that would soon force the entire community to confront exactly how dependent the reservoir had always been on the infrastructure Patricia tried so hard to control. The meeting that changed everything took place on a Thursday evening inside the community clubhouse. By the time I arrived, nearly every chair was occupied. Residents filled the room. Additional people stood along the walls. Engineers sat near the front beside county representatives. Stacks of documents covered several tables. The atmosphere felt different from previous meetings. Earlier gatherings had been driven by assumptions, rumors, and confidence. This one revolved around evidence. I took a seat near the back and quietly observed. Patricia sat at the front of the room, maintaining the same composed expression she had worn for months. Yet there was something different in her posture. The certainty that once defined every discussion seemed noticeably weaker. The meeting began with routine updates regarding reservoir operations. Monitoring reports were reviewed. Water level trends were discussed. Engineering consultants summarized their findings. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. A county engineer stood and rolled out a large infrastructure map across the front display table. The paper stretched nearly 8 feet wide. Colored lines crossed the page in every direction. Easements, support routes, maintenance corridors, pumping stations, transfer points, and distribution systems appeared in remarkable detail. For a few moments, the room fell completely silent. Most residents had never seen the full network before. They only knew the reservoir existed. They had never seen how many moving parts supported it. The engineer began tracing routes with a pointer. He explained how various systems interacted during periods of high demand. He described emergency support provisions. He identified infrastructure dependencies that had existed for decades. Then he reached a section of the map highlighted in bright blue. Every eye in the room followed the pointer. The route crossed directly through my property. The engineer paused before speaking again. This corridor, he explained, is part of the supplemental support framework referenced in historical agreements and county records. Several residents immediately leaned forward. Others began comparing copies of documents already distributed throughout the room. The engineer continued presenting records, easement diagrams, maintenance agreements, and operational procedures. Every page supported the same conclusion. The reservoir had never functioned independently. It relied on infrastructure relationships established long before the HOA existed. More importantly, those relationships remained active. The room grew increasingly quiet as realization spread. Questions followed. Who approved the interference? Were legal reviews completed beforehand? Did anyone examine the historical agreements before actions were taken? County representatives answered carefully. Documentation had been reviewed extensively during the investigation. The records spoke for themselves. Nobody needed dramatic accusations. The facts were already sitting on the table. I glanced toward Patricia. For the first time since this entire situation began, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not angry, not defensive, uncomfortable. Because the map made something impossible to deny. The issue had never been about one property owner refusing HOA demands. The issue was that critical infrastructure had been treated as though it were a neighborhood disagreement. Those are not the same thing. By the end of the presentation, residents understood that clearly. As the meeting concluded, people gathered around the engineering maps, studying details for themselves. Conversations filled the room. Questions shifted away from me and toward the decisions that created the situation. Several neighbors approached simply to say they finally understood what had happened. Others admitted they never realized how interconnected the system was. I thanked them and kept my responses brief. The maps had already done all the work. Walking out into the cool evening air, I looked back through the clubhouse windows. Residents still surrounded the display tables. Engineers continued answering questions. Documents changed hands. Facts were finally visible. And after months of confusion, assumptions, and misplaced confidence, the entire community had just witnessed the same thing I discovered weeks earlier. The reservoir story had always been hidden inside the maps. The resolution arrived less than 2 weeks after the clubhouse meeting. Not with dramatic speeches. Not with public confrontations. Infrastructure disputes rarely end that way. They end through reports, signatures, approvals, and corrections. One morning I walked into the pump house and found a team of authorized contractors completing the final steps necessary to restore full operation. The disconnect that had started this entire chain of events was no longer the center of attention. By then, everyone understood the real issue had never been a single switch. It had been a failure to understand the system connected to it. The county review concluded exactly as the documents predicted. The supplemental support framework remained valid. The easement agreements remained enforceable. The infrastructure relationships remained active. Most importantly, interference with those systems had created consequences that could have been avoided entirely through proper review and cooperation. Once the findings became official, solutions followed quickly. Procedures were updated. Oversight requirements were strengthened. Communication protocols were revised. Engineers finalized recommendations designed to prevent similar situations from occurring again. It was all remarkably practical. That is usually how real justice works. It looks far less dramatic than people imagine. Several days later, the reservoir support arrangements were restored under the revised framework. Monitoring reports immediately reflected the change. Water management returned to expected operating patterns. Maintenance concerns eased. The endless meetings began disappearing from community calendars. For most residents, life returned to normal. Lawns remained green. Sprinklers operated on schedule. The reservoir once again became something people rarely thought about, which, ironically, is the highest compliment any infrastructure system can receive. If nobody notices it, the system is probably working correctly. As for Patricia, her position became increasingly difficult. Residents had seen the maps. They had read the records. They had reviewed the timelines. Trust, once lost, is much harder to restore than a water system. Eventually, leadership changes occurred within the HOA. I was not involved in those decisions. I did not need to be. The community reached its own conclusions. Facts tend to do that. They allow people to make informed choices without being told what to think. One afternoon, several months after everything ended, I found myself standing near the reservoir during a routine inspection with county personnel. The water surface shimmered beneath a bright blue sky. Birds drifted across the shoreline. The entire valley looked peaceful. One of the engineers glanced toward me and laughed. All of this because somebody thought they understood one pump, he said. I laughed too because he was not entirely wrong. The funny thing was that the pump had never been the important part of the story. The maps were. The agreements were. The decades of planning hidden beneath the ground were. Systems matter. Connections matter. History matters. People ignore those things at their own risk. Later that evening, I returned home and placed the final report inside the same filing cabinet where this story had truly begun. The cabinet closed with a familiar metallic click. Outside, water flowed through the restored system exactly as intended. The pressure gauges read normal. The pumps hummed steadily. Everything worked. I stood for a moment listening to that sound. The quiet rhythm of infrastructure doing its job. Then I smiled. Because in the end, nobody won through power. Nobody won through intimidation. Nobody won through arguments. The maps won. The records won. The truth hidden inside decades of paperwork won. Patricia tried to send a message by shutting down a piece of infrastructure she did not understand. What she never realized was that the entire community depended on understanding it. And once the facts surfaced, the system delivered its own verdict. Patiently. Legally. Inevitably.